The village lay nestled in the dense folds of the Naga hills, where the mist clung to the trees like whispered warnings from the dead. To the people who lived there, the land was both their sanctuary and their prison, a place where unseen forces ruled the night and tradition dictated survival. The elders spoke of a shadow that roamed beyond the last hut, an ancient horror that had existed long before their ancestors built their homes. It was said to have no name, only a purpose to take what it desired. And what it desired most were children. Among the villagers was a man named Akadi, a hunter known for his unwavering courage and keen instincts. He had spent years tracking leopards and wild boars, his arrows swift, his blade sharp. Yet even he did not speak lightly of the stories. His wife, Imtala, had heard them from her grandmother, warnings whispered beside the fire when the wind howled through the bamboo walls. Every few years, a child would disappear and the village would mourn. No bodies were ever found, only abandoned sandals, a lone toy dropped in haste, or a trail of footprints that led to the forest's edge and stopped, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. It had been 3 years since the last child had gone missing. 3 years since a mother had wailed into the night, her voice carrying into the trees, unanswered. The village had begun to believe, or at least to hope, that the evil had moved on. But evil never left, it only waited. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the village children played near the river, their laughter echoing against the valley walls. Among them was Akadi's son, a boy of 7 with bright eyes and a spirit untamed by fear. He chased after a butterfly, his small feet carrying him farther from the others. By the time he realized how deep he had wandered into the tall grass, the laughter of his friends had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. A gust of wind swept through the reeds, bending them like bowstrings, and a strange scent filled the air, something foul, like decayed leaves and wet earth. The boy turned, sensing a presence. At first there was nothing. Then, between the trees, a shape emerged. It was hunched and impossibly tall, its limbs stretched like gnarled roots, its eyes 2 burning coals in the dying light. The boy did not scream. He could not. His voice was caught in his throat, choked by an unseen force. The creature did not rush forward, nor did it lunge as a wild animal would. It only stood, watching. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, it was gone. The boy ran, stumbling through the grass, his chest tight with the weight of his own terror. He burst into the village, gasping, his face streaked with tears. Akadi found him first, kneeling beside him as the boy clutched his father's arms with desperate fingers. Between his sobs, he told them of the thing in the forest. The elders gathered that night, their faces drawn, their eyes shadowed by something deeper than fear, recognition. They had heard this story before, many times over. They knew what it meant. The village priest, a man whose hair had turned white with the burden of his knowledge, stepped forward. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "It is awake again." The words settled over them like a curse. Akadi did not sleep that night. He sat outside his hut, his spear across his lap, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves had changed. It was too quiet. The night itself seemed to be holding its breath. Somewhere in the darkness, he imagined those glowing eyes, watching. The next day, the villagers gathered in the clearing. Children kept close, their mothers' hands gripping their shoulders with quiet urgency. The priest began the rituals, offerings of rice and betel nut placed at the forest's edge, incense burning in clay bowls. They prayed, pleaded, bargained. But deep down, they knew that prayers had never saved them before. 3 nights later, another child disappeared. Her name was Lichu, the blacksmith's daughter. She had gone to fetch water from the stream before bed. Her mother had found the bucket overturned, its contents seeping into the dirt. But Lichu was gone. This time there were signs, claw marks on the rocks, as if something had dragged itself from the depths of the earth. Strands of hair caught in the branches, too coarse to be human. The men searched the forest until dawn, but there was nothing. Only the sound of the river, indifferent to their grief. Akadi stood at the edge of the village, staring into the trees, his fists clenched. He had always thought himself fearless, but now, for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Not just for himself, but for his son, for the village, for the knowledge that this thing was not merely a story. It was real, and it had returned. The elders spoke of leaving, of abandoning the village and seeking refuge elsewhere. But where could they go? The land was their blood, their ancestors' bones buried beneath the very earth they stood on. To leave was to surrender, to let the darkness claim their home. No, they would not run. They would fight. Akadi took up his bow, his quiver heavy with arrows. He was not the only one. Others joined him, warriors, hunters, men who had lost too much to let fear paralyze them. They would go into the forest. They would hunt the hunter. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the land, the men disappeared into the trees, their weapons gleaming under the pale light of the rising moon. Some of them would never return. She had always known love would be her undoing. Imtala had grown up hearing the tales of demons and vanished children, but they had always felt like stories belonging to another time, another world. Life was harsh in the village, yet it was predictable. The sun still rose, the rivers still carried water, and the forests, dark as they were, still provided food. Fear lingered at the edges, but it had not yet consumed her. Then the disappearances began again, and the old terrors returned. That was when she met him. Tebin was not from her village. He had arrived with a traveling group of traders, his presence as fleeting as the river mist. But in the short time he stayed, he had disrupted the rhythm of her existence. He was different from the men she had known. His laughter was easy, his hands callous from a life spent wandering. He carried the scent of distant lands, of places Imtala had never seen but often dreamt of. His words wove pictures of valleys where the rivers ran wider, where the forest stretched endlessly, untouched by the nightmares of her people. She was drawn to him like a moth to flame, reckless in a way she had never been before. At first, their meetings were stolen moments, passing glances at the village square, whispered conversations when no one was listening. But soon, caution was abandoned. Imtala found herself slipping away in the evenings, meeting him beyond the reach of watchful eyes. Beneath the towering trees, away from the suffocating fear of home, she learned the sound of his heartbeat, the roughness of his palm against hers. Tebin listened to the stories of the demon with a skeptical smile. He had heard similar tales in his own travels, myths told to keep children from wandering too far. Men fear what they do not understand, he told her one evening, as they sat by the stream, the water reflecting shards of moonlight. But fear is only as powerful as the hold we give it. Imtala wanted to believe him. She wanted to live in his world, where such horrors were mere figments of imagination, where there was no unseen shadow lurking in the trees. She wanted to believe they could leave together, escape the fate that had already claimed too many lives. But the night of the disappearance changed everything. The village was still mourning Lichu when another child was taken, a boy barely old enough to walk. His mother had stepped away for only a moment, but that was all it took. When she turned back, he was gone, his tiny footprints ending abruptly in the dirt. The village descended into panic. The hunters who had ventured into the forest returned with nothing but grim faces and whispered prayers. Akadi, once fearless, looked hollow. The priest declared that the demon was growing bolder, that it would not stop until it had claimed its fill. Imtala was forbidden from leaving the village at night. It was dangerous, her mother warned. The darkness was no longer just darkness. It was something else, something hungry. But love makes fools of even the cautious. She sneaked out that night, as she had so many times before, but there was no joy in her escape, no thrill in the secrecy. The fear that clung to the village had seeped into her bones, made her heart beat too fast as she picked her way through the undergrowth. When she found Tebin, standing in their usual spot, she wanted to tell him that she was afraid, that she had never truly believed in the stories before, but now she wasn't so sure. Before she could speak, he hushed her with a finger to his lips. His eyes, always filled with mischief, were sharp now, focused. "Something is watching us," he whispered. The forest held its breath. The leaves did not rustle, the insects did not sing. Even the river seemed quieter. Imtala turned, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then she saw them. Eyes, glowing, unblinking, suspended in the darkness like embers refusing to die. A guttural sound rolled through the air, something that was neither human nor animal. It vibrated through her chest, through the marrow of her bones. Tebin stepped in front of her, his body tense, his knife glinting in the weak moonlight. He was a fighter, but he had never faced this before. Nothing could prepare a man for this. The eyes did not move, but the presence pressed against them, thick and suffocating. Then, in an instant, the darkness shifted. The shape lunged. Tebin shoved her back, his voice breaking through the terror. "Run!" She did not think, did not hesitate. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She did not know if Tebin was behind her, did not know if he had stayed to fight or if he had been swallowed whole by the thing in the dark. The village was only a few steps away when she heard it. A scream, raw and violent, cut short too soon. She did not stop. She collapsed at the entrance of her hut, her mother rushing to her side. The words tumbled from her lips, disjointed, broken. The elders gathered, listening in grave silence. When she was done, the priest closed his eyes and murmured something under his breath. "The demon does not take grown men." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled. "If he was killed, his body will be found. If not," he did not finish. He did not have to. The hunters went into the forest at dawn. They searched for hours, but Tebin was gone. No blood, no tracks. Only the faint imprint of footprints leading toward the river, and stopping, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Imtala did not speak for days. She sat by the stream, staring at the water, waiting for something that would never return. The villagers whispered about curses, about fate. Some said she had been foolish to love an outsider. Others said the demon had taken him as punishment, that he had stepped too close to something beyond mortal comprehension. But Imtala knew the truth. The demon had not taken him. The forest had, and somewhere, deep in the shadows, it still watched. The nights had grown longer since Tebin vanished. The village no longer whispered about leaving. They spoke of survival, of whether the demon would ever be satisfied. Fear had become their shadow, clinging to them in ways they could not shake. Even the bravest men hesitated before stepping too close to the forest's edge, knowing that something ancient and merciless lay beyond. Imtala no longer waited by the stream. She no longer hoped. Whatever Tebin had been, whatever he had meant to her, was now lost to the silence that stretched between the trees. But the silence had not forgotten. It called to her. One evening, as she sat outside her hut, listening to the wind rustling through the thatched roofs, a sound drifted through the air, low, distorted, almost human. Her breath caught. It came again, a whisper tangled in the night. Her name. She rose without thinking, her body moving before her mind could catch up. The village was asleep, the fires burning low. She stepped barefoot across the cool earth, past the huts, past the last remnants of safety, toward the waiting trees. There, at the border between the village and the unknown, stood a figure. Tebin. At least, it looked like him. He stood motionless, his body outlined by the weak moonlight, his features twisted by shadows. His clothes were torn, his skin marked with something darker than dirt. But his eyes were not the same. They were too still, too knowing. She took a step forward, heart hammering. Tebin. His lips curled, a movement that barely resembled a smile. "You shouldn't have run." The voice was his, and yet it wasn't. It carried an edge, something raw and unearthly, something that sent ice curling through her veins. She took a step back, his head tilted, as if considering her reaction, and then he moved, too fast, too smooth, closing the space between them before she could turn. Fingers brushed her wrist, cold as river stones. She tore away and ran. She did not stop until she reached her hut, her breath coming in ragged bursts, her body shaking. She wanted to believe that she had imagined it, that grief had finally twisted itself into madness. But when she glanced back, She saw him still standing there, just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching. By morning, he was gone. The elders listened in silence as she spoke, their faces grave. When she finished, the priest let out a slow breath. He has been claimed. Imtala shook her head, unwilling to accept the finality of the words. He's still Tebin. He spoke to me. No, the priest said gently. What you saw was not him. Akadi, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. Then what was it? The priest hesitated before answering. A remnant, a shadow of what once was. Akadi stood, his jaw tight. Then we end this. No one argued. The hunters prepared as they had before, sharpening their weapons, whispering their prayers. But this time was different. This time, they carried more than arrows and spears. They carried fire, the only thing the darkness could not swallow. Imtala went with them. She was not asked to stay behind, nor did she offer to. Whatever had become of Tebin, she needed to see it through. The forest swallowed them whole, the path ahead vanishing into shifting darkness. They moved carefully, guided by instinct and the memory of old trails. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of damp earth and something fouler, something rotting. Then they saw him. Tebin stood in the clearing, waiting. He did not move as they approached, his body unnaturally still. Only his eyes followed them, glinting in the firelight. Akadi raised a spear. If you're still Tebin, speak now. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly his lips parted. I am hungry. The voice was wrong. It slithered through the air, heavy with something primal, something no longer bound by flesh and bone. Imtala stepped forward before anyone could stop her. Tebin. His head snapped toward her. You left me. She swallowed the ache in her throat. You told me to run. His mouth twitched, something between a grin and a snarl. I did. A pause, then softer, almost wistful. But I wish you hadn't. She took a shaking breath. Are you in pain? Tebin's body swayed slightly, as if something inside him was unraveling. His fingers twitched, curling and uncurling. Yes. The word barely escaped, fragile, breaking apart the longer it lingered. The priest stepped forward then, his voice steady. He does not belong here anymore. Tebin's eyes flicked to the priest, and for the first time, his expression twisted. The warmth faded from his face, leaving behind something hollow, something endless. You cannot send me back, he murmured. We must, the priest said. Tebin's mouth stretched into something that was not a smile. Then I will take her with me. Before anyone could react, he lunged. Imtala barely had time to gasp before hands, cold, impossibly strong, wrapped around her arms, pulling her forward. She struggled, but it was like fighting against the weight of the river, something vast and inescapable. Akadi was faster. The blade sliced through the night, a silver arc catching the firelight before plunging deep into Tebin's side. He let out a sound, half scream, half roar, his grip loosening. Imtala stumbled back as the hunters surged forward, torches raised, flames licking at the darkness. Tebin staggered, his breath coming in ragged gasps, something black seeping from his wound. His gaze found hers one last time, and for the briefest moment, he looked like himself again. I never wanted to leave, he whispered. Then the fire reached him. The scream that followed did not belong to him. It belonged to something else, something ancient and starving, something that had worn his skin like a borrowed garment. The flames consumed him, the shadows twisting and writhing until, at last, there was nothing left. The forest held its breath. Then, slowly, the wind returned. The air lightened. The silence broke. By morning, the village knew. The darkness had lifted. Imola did not weep. Not then. Not as the hunters returned. Not as the priest declared the demon vanquished. It was only later, alone by the stream, that she let herself grieve. Tebin was gone, but something of him had remained, if only for a moment. And that, she told herself, was enough. The forest was still. The water ran clear. The children laughed once more. But deep in the trees, where the fire had burned brightest, the earth remained blackened, as if something had once stood there and watched, and had not yet truly left.